I'm going to talk about a very old standing problem and claim that we have essentially solved it. And not everyone in the field will agree with me, so I will want to put in a caveat. This is my own personal views to a large extent, but I think we have very strong evidence supporting it. So um, the first thing is a kind of apology. This is a big data conference, and am I doing big data? Well, sort of. Our lab, David Reich's lab at Harvard Evolutionary Biology, really has by now an impressive data set. We've got 40,000 human fossils for which we've got useful DNA. That's growing by several thousand fossils a year, and the whole genome. Not always whole genome sequence, often from genotyping arrays, if you biologists, you know what those are. But this is still a pretty formidable data set, which needs a good deal of care and feeding, because it's a complicated data set. I mean, this is coming from many different cultures, different places, and so on and so forth. So I'm talking about one particular corner of this data set, which is relevant to how the largest human family of languages arose. And I wanted to say that before I say anything else, I really like to be interrupted. All questions are welcome. Not all of them I'll be able to answer. And just a remark in passing on Renaissance technologies, here's a Renaissance slogan which might appeal to this particular workshop. The slogan goes, "There's no data like more data." And I think most statisticians would agree with that. I like to say more data beats smarts any day of the week. Okay. So the story begins in the 1780s. It goes a long way back, where a British administrator in India, who of course had a standard upper-class British education, he would have known classical Latin and Greek well, and he got interested in Sanskrit in India. And so he wrote this, which I'll just read it out here. It's a remarkable quote. "The Sanskrit language, whatever its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, that could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source which perhaps no longer exists." So Jones is talking here about what we now call Indo-European, and he was completely correct. There must have been a common origin. There was a community of speakers somewhere speaking that common language, and we'd like to understand who they were, where they were living, what they did, and how their language spread. So that's the problem. And I think that people have been studying this intensively for essentially 250 years. And I think the problem has largely now been settled because of the advent of DNA genetics. What happened before is we have information from archaeology, we have information from linguistics, but the two together did not really prove enough to settle the question. And now we have a third strand of information, which has, I think, tilted the balance. So that I think I now know what happened, at least in broad outlines. So in this talk, I want to do a few things. I want to tell you about the Indo-European language family. I want to tell you about two now extinct languages, very important for the figuring out what occurred, which are Hittite and Tocharian. My guess is that some of you won't even have heard of Tocharian, but it's a very important language for thinking about what occurred. I want to tell you about a culture on the Russian steppe, the Yamnaya, that flourished around 3000 BC. I want to tell you how I got to Anatolia. The Hittite Empire was in Western Anatolia from about 2000 to 1300 BC, and the Hittites spoke Indo-European, and how Indo-European got to Western China. A remarkable fact. Okay, so here is a linguistic phylogenetic tree that I'm not going to go through the whole tree here, because in this talk, I didn't want to talk about the spread of Indo-European, although I think we know a good deal about it, but more about the very early events, where I think the homeland was, and the initial splits. I'm very happy to answer questions, and we know a good deal more than I'm going to talk about in this talk. But the full story of the how Indo-Europeans spread around the planet is I think, too complicated for an hour lecture. Okay, so let's talk about some features here. So the root of this tree is Proto-Indo-European, which we call PIE, and it's the hypothesized ancestral language of all other Indo-European languages. And the first split is into Hittite. Now, I want to say a little bit about how we know these things linguistically. Historical linguistics is really a science. And in particular, there is a technology, the comparative method, which was developed in the late 19th century and quite reliably can reconstruct ancestral languages from daughter languages. That's not obvious at all, but it's really true. And of course, this has been done for Proto-Indo-European, and in particular, what I'll jump ahead a little bit, called late Proto-Indo-European, which is the ancestor of all languages except Hittite and Tocharian, which I'm going to come to. And at least for late Proto-Indo-European, we know thousands of words in that vocabulary, and even a good deal of information about how they were pronounced. That's a really remarkable fact. This is a language that hasn't been spoken for more than 4,000 years. It was never written down, and yet nevertheless, we know a great deal about what it was, what its vocabulary was, what its grammar was, and that gives you, in fact, some information, which is important, what I'm going to say, about the culture that these people had. You don't have words in your language for objects that don't exist, right? Huh? Yeah.
These were written languages. How do you make this tree? Because are they grammatically structured, or are they?
Well, what's going on here? I'll very briefly say something about the comparative method. What happens, the crucial thing in language shifts turns out to be sound changes. To give you an example, in English in the 14th century, rather quickly, over about no longer than 50 years, the E, which is pronounced in Old English and German, the ending E in a word, was dropped. So as you all know, English has thousands and thousands of words which are spelt with an E on the end, but we don't pronounce it. And there were vowel changes as well, which we can tell because of poetry. So these are, of course, written languages, and we know a great deal more about them. But what happens is you get a sound shift, and then all the words with one sound shift to another sound. So what happens is you get two daughter languages, and a different sound shifts have occurred. To give you a example, uh, the English in for heart and is of course heart. German's very similar. French is cœur. Not at all obvious, but cœur and heart are cognate. And you can recover that the original Indo-European had a KH sound. And in French, the aspirate, the H has been dropped. And in English, the K sound has been dropped. And there are many, many pairs of words where there's KH that's happened in French and in English that way. So that's basically the technology. You recover the sound shifts, and then you can reconstruct the ancestral words. Does that help answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I will say, I'm not a linguist. And one of the things I want you to take away from this talk is this work is super multidisciplinary. We're using archaeology, we're using linguistics, we're now using genetics, and there's nobody in the world, I guarantee you, who is an adequate expert on all three disciplines. And there are very few who are expert on two, and I probably know them all, and I'm not one of them. Here's a question.
I have a naive question. Suppose you have two languages, populations, they trade, the language mix.
Yes.
You see two languages with common traits because.
Yes. So you have loan words.
The question is, how different is this from having an ancestral language?
Fairly different because it's not. You don't get sound shifts that way. To give you an example, in English we have a common word, garage, right? That's a loan word from French, and we can tell because the je sound in garage is not a native sound in English. Every English word, and there are only two of them I know, that has a je sound at the end of the word, is a loan word from French. And that sound does not exist in Middle English, right? So you can't always identify loan words. Sometimes it's difficult, and it's harder if the languages are very close. But there's a lot you can do, and it's a science, not just guessing. All right. So I want to go through the top of this tree a little bit. So Hittite branches off. The Hittites lived in Western Anatolia around 2000 BC and on, and we have written texts. A major 20th century discovery was the Hittite inscriptions are written in cuneiform, which was well known, and we could read the cuneiform sounds, and the language was Indo-European, which was amazing, right? There are various double texts and so on. So Hittite is pretty much fully transcribable. There's a few words we don't know what they mean, but by and large we can read Hittite, and there's a reasonable body of texts. So we have a fairly good knowledge of the language, and there are sister languages in the same region forming an Indo-Anatolian family. And Hittite is very divergent from every other Indo-European language in this tree, and a good guess, which is important to me, is that the split is 4000 BC or a little earlier. It can't be very ancient, or it wouldn't be as close as it is, and it can't be much more recent, or the extreme divergence would not have occurred. And the next split is another amazing discovery, which is Tocharian. Tocharian is also a written language. It's relatively late by the standards of this talk. We have texts, I think, a few texts around 500 BC, much more about 2,000 years before present, about 0 BC. It's in Western China, the Tarim Basin. It's written in Chinese characters, but pronounced phonetically. And many of the texts are Buddhist scriptures, which are well known in other languages and form a kind of Rosetta Stone, right? So Tocharian is also fully readable, and it's also divergent from the other late Proto-Indo-European languages, but much less divergent than Hittite. And so we think the split occurred about 3000 BC or a bit earlier, so 3200, say. And a major question is how the heck did Indo-Europeans get to Western China and split off that early? And that was a mystery, and I think we now have a pretty good idea, actually. I'm going to come to that. And then we have late Proto-Indo-European, and I'm not going to talk much about the rest of this tree, except I want to put in a little teaser, which I'm not going to explain, but you can ask me later if you want. Down near the bottom of this tree, you'll see there's a group of languages, Balto-Slavic, which include Lithuanian and most of the Slavic languages today. And over here, we have an Indo-Iranian branch where old Persian and old Vedic Sanskrit are the daughter languages. And those two groups have a common ancestor. Now, if you think about the geography, the Baltics and India are not exactly close together. So how on earth did that happen? And the linguists identified this connection quite a long time ago, but I think we now know exactly how that split happened, but I'm not going to tell you now. So that's a tease. Yes?
What are the circles? Why isn't there?
Okay, so could you speak up?
Sorry, what are the anti-circles? Why isn't there a name in there?
I'm having trouble understanding. I'm a little deaf, I'm afraid. Can you?
Yeah, and I have a strong French accent. So
yeah, we're working together as a team. Yes.
What are the anti-circles?
Oh, those are hypothetical ancestral languages. Okay, no? Mostly unlabeled, but we could obviously put labels on it. But here, for example, the one I've just been talking about is a hypothesized language ancestral to Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian, right? Right?
But how can you hypothesize that you have just two, like, you have three languages before going from Indo-Iranian to late Proto-Indo-European? Because that, rather than just one.
Well, you mean you have a star-like tree?
Yes. I mean, there are multiple.
Well, if you have a star-like tree, you would wind up with a very different type of phylogeny. What we're seeing here is that the Old Persian and Old Indian are strongly similar to each other and should have a common language which is not common to anything else, right? Similarly for Balto-Slavic, similarly for, there are connections between those two groups that don't occur anywhere else, right? In the tree, and so on. You work your way up, right? This is classic tree reconstruction, and the details can be argued about. People will argue about it. And the tree model is no doubt in detail too simple, right? You can get languages merging in complicated ways. And I think, I'm not going to go into detail here, and I always say I'm not a linguistic expert. The languages of Western Europe, Celtic, German, and Italic, probably have complicated relationships with each other. There are some difficulties in the tree reconstruction there. But in general, we're going to try and build a tree up this way, because binary splits are probably easily the most common thing to happen. Right? Okay, let me move on. Yeah. So, summarizing what I've been saying, we have an ancestral language, Proto-Indo-European, and I'd definitely like to know the homeland. It's even been argued by some radical linguists that there was no such thing and that there's some sort of cloud of speakers, but I think most linguists don't believe that. I don't believe it. Then the first important event is the Proto-Hittite splits off, right? And becomes disconnected from the rest of the Indo-European family. Then the next split is so you get late Proto-Indo-European forming by definition. It's the ancestral language, everything else except Hittite. Then the next event is Tocharian splits off, and then late Proto-Indo-European diverges and splits into everybody else. That's a very, very interesting process, but I'm not really going to talk about that much, except in passing and answer questions maybe. If you're thinking about the early origins of Indo-European and the homeland, it's the early splits that matter, right? You know, for example, Celtic and Italic probably separate something like 1500 BC. The details of that are not very relevant to what's going on in the 5th millennium, I think. No? It's so much later, it's not informative. Okay, so how does genetics help? And of course, this is essentially new technology. The modern genetics aren't really informative for what's going on because they're too late. But with genetics, and now with ancient DNA, there's 3 things we can do well, at least. First of all, we can detect population movements. You see, you go back in time, and you see population A here, population B here. They're genetically distinct. And then a little later, you see a population where A was living that now looks like a mix of A and B. And you now know that some people with B genetics must have moved into that region. We are good at dating admixture. At least if the populations are reasonably divergent and the admixture is not very, very old. And finally, and this is actually relatively new technology, we're pretty good at identifying pairs of relatives. So these are the 3 things we can do, and pretty much combinations of these things dominate what population genetics do. These are the ingredients.
Could you say something a little bit more about dating admixtures? Because
Actually, I'm
because it seems strange to me that I went down a black hole a few years ago after David Rick's book came out, and it was strange to me that you could believe these maximum likelihood models that were used to date so well. To identify the mixtures seemed more believable. It's not that I don't believe. I just think I didn't
well, let me
understand.
tell you, I'm actually an expert on this.
Yeah, I know you are.
I wrote, so maybe it's good reason you asked the question. I have a program called Dates that I'm actually working on now. The technical challenge, which is quite interesting, is do something about double admixture events, where you're looking at a population where there's been an old admixture and a new admixture, and you want to date both events. And there's a program in the works I'm writing on this. But okay, so let's just talk about single admixture. Why might you be able to do it? Well, what happens is immediately after admixture, you get admixture LD. Our previous speaker talked about how when you cross 2 distinct genomes, the result is as blocks of one and blocks of another. Right? So what that means is that nearby on the genome, you're going to get strong correlations to what the ancestry was. Right? That's the jargon here. That's LD. It's admixture LD. But generation by generation, that breaks down. So the basic idea is you see how much that breakdown has occurred. That tells you how many generations have occurred, and that works pretty well. Now, the methods I use are not actually maximum likelihood. They're what I call if you're a physicist here, you'll know about two-point methods, right? I'm looking at a pair of places in the genome, a certain genetic distance apart, and asking what the correlation is between those pairs as I average across all the pairs in the genome at that distance, right? So that's a two-point method. And I can only compute what I would call I'll tell you, here's a dirty secret in genetics. You'll read papers that talk about composite likelihoods. That means I have a score, and it isn't a likelihood, but I'm going to pretend it is. Right? So that's what we do. We write down a likelihood for the 2 points, and we pretend they're all independent, which they're not, right? And we maximize that. Well, seems to give good historical answers, and it works great in simulation. Does that answer your question?
Data do you, how many genomes would you need to average the 2 point? Or is it, can you do it with a single
Yes,
genome
you can.
and you can average across location is good enough?
You can do this with one individual who's diploid, but of course, it's very noisy, right? I like to use as many as I can, and there's also issues about about modeling the parental populations. These are all technical issues, and you can be blocked in multiple ways. But in general, the technique's remarkably good and amazingly good in simulation. In fact, I had a graduate student who's now a tenured professor at Berkeley, Priya Majani, a very brilliant student. And when she was working with me when she was a grad student on this dating technology, and in ideal circumstances in simulation, she showed you could get good answers at 500 generations back, mixture, which in humans is 15,000 years. But I joked with Priya, this is great technically and utterly useless, because the assumptions are that no intervening populations came in the last since that mixture, and there's no populations in which that's true over 15,000 years. Right? So there we are. But anyway, for 1,000 years, we often have examples where we can do extremely well. That's where we are. All right. So our story begins on the River Volga, and I have rather bad maps here, which I'll apologize for. But I wanted to write down some regions of the Caucasus and steppe, which are relevant to our story. So there's three important rivers here. Here's the Volga River, massive river in Russia, which flows into the Caspian Sea. There's the River Don here, and here's the River Dnieper. And the area between the Don and Dnieper, which has been unfortunately much in the news, is also a crucial area for the story. So on the Volga River, we have, and we're talking now about 5th millennium and earlier even. We see many settlements along the Volga, probably primarily living by fishing in the river. And as you move up and down the river, the genetics of the settlement shift, and you get what we call a genetic decline. It's very clear that what we're looking at here is a mix of two divergent groups, and the mixing coefficients depend on where you are on the river. So the explanation, which is almost certainly correct, is that the settlements are exchanging mates, almost certainly women. We think these cultures are patrilocal. So the women are marrying out, and they move up and down the river to nearby settlements, which causes a gradual diffusion of genetics that's dependent on where you are on the river. And a little story I put against myself. When I first got this data, I was lazy, and I just plotted latitude and longitude, and didn't see anything very significant, or at least not convincing. And then I decided to plot it on where we were on the river, and it was just totally clear. But that's what's going on. Because, of course, people aren't moving north and south. They're moving the easy way by boat along the river. That's what's happening. In particular, you get a population we call Eastern hunter-gatherers, which occurs also much further north, even as far north as modern Finland. And downriver, with in the lower Volga, near the Volga Delta, we see very different genetics. And the lower Volga populations are extremely interesting. Here's a map, which you don't have to look at in detail. I just wanted to show you how many sites we're looking at here. There's a huge amount of collaborative work, and we've just published a paper. I think it had like 150 co-authors, and many archaeological sites. Some of them published for the first time, and many older ones. In this kind of work, the papers always have many authors, because you're using genetic material from many archaeological sites, and it's only right that any archaeologist who's helped you should be a co-author. That's why you get so many authors. All right, so you get settlements on the Volga, moving up and down, and this genetic decline. Okay, all right. Now the next event is there's movement between the lower Volga and northern Caucasus. We have two populations, Berezhovka, which is on the settlement on the Volga, and a site with the wonderful Soviet name of Progress 2, which I assumed was translation from Russian, but it's not. The Soviets called it Progress 2. And we have data from both those sites, and they're genetically, on a population level, essentially identical. The only explanation is there was movement between the sites, and it can't be more than 1 or 2 generations. So that's very interesting. I don't actually know which direction it happened. My guess is east to west, but I've got no real proof of that. And that's a piece that's an unsettled question. That happens about 500 BCE, and very fast. All right. So the next part of the story is now crucial. In 2007, David Anthony, who's now a colleague, a friend of mine, he's an archaeologist of the Russian steppe. He wrote a book called Horses, Wheels, and Language. And he argued entirely on archaeological and linguistic grounds that there was a steppe culture, the Yamnaya, who were the first speakers of Indo-European. And he thinks they were riding horses, one of the very first horse riding populations in the world. And they certainly had large wheeled wagons, which are impressive pieces of technology. These are wooden wagons, ox-drawn, and the archaeologists think they could carry about 2 tons of stuff. So these are big things. And making a wagon like that you can drive over the steppe is no small feat, actually. No? And the Yamnaya are the first human population who were able to live and flourish in the steppe grasslands. Earlier populations could live in river valleys, but the vast Russian steppe was basically unexploited. And if you think about it, if you're a steppe pastoralist, you're moving your animals all the time. You've got lots of stuff you'd like to be able to carry. You can chuck your kids in the back of the wagon, and that's an enormous advantage. And it turned out to be absolutely crucial. So David Attenborough wrote this book, and it contains no genetics whatever. And then we get genetics from Yamnaya, and it turns out that every modern speaker of Indo-European languages has Yamnaya genetics as an important part of their genome. So looking around this room, nearly all of you will have substantial amounts of Yamnaya steppe genetics. All right. So that was very intriguing. I mean, it seemed to me made it extremely probable that David's hypothesis was correct. I mean, you have a hypothesis like this. You get no information about genetics at all. The genetics totally match up. It's pretty unlikely you're wrong. Okay, so so I said a little bit already about these. They're nomadic pastoralists. They're animal herders. The steppe grassland is thin. So what happens is you graze your animals in some region, but after a month or so, the grass has all been eaten, and you have to move on, right? So then there's compulsory. They have to be nomadic. They're warlike. Very clearly, they're patrilocal, and in the daughter languages, it's very clear. I mean, David Anthony taught me that this phrase "undying fame" occurs in both Homer and the Vedas. You become an important man by being good at killing. I wish that wasn't true, but that's how it works. No? They have characteristic burial mounds, which we call kurgans, which are very large structures of earth with complicated ritual structures underneath the earth mound. So we're lucky there, because the steppe's fairly flat, and you can just stand in the steppe and see these kurgans. They're very, very easy to identify today. Many of them haven't even been excavated yet. And something that's a bit scary when you're thinking about prehistory is suppose the Yamnaya had cremated their dead. I think they'd be archaeologically essentially invisible. No settlements, no burials, right? And so there'd be a hugely important human culture in the past, which we might know nothing about at all. We might not even know they existed. That's a bit of a caution about how much we almost certainly don't know. Okay, so it now becomes crucial. If you think that Anthony was right, and that you identify the LPIE with Yamnaya, it now becomes crucial as to how that formed. And that, I think, is what we managed to do. So so we see this population, this Progress 2 Berezovska population, which we call CLV, Caucasus Lower Volga. And around 4000 BC or a little earlier, they move into the Dnieper-Don region. And a culture forms there, which we call the Seredny. It's well known to archaeology. And these are hunter-gatherers, a little fishing, maybe some small-scale pastoralism. It's kind of a mixed economy. But they're not the Yamnaya. They don't have wheeled vehicles and so on and so forth. But the key, the fact is that genetically they're Yamnaya, right? So what's going on is Seredny form, and like 1,000 years later, the Yamnaya culture forms. But I believe that genetically, the Yamnaya are essentially a straight descendant of Seredny. And it's entirely reasonable to think that they would have had a common language. I mean, no doubt a heavily derived language, but that kind of identifies Seredni as very probably speaking Indo-European, and the majority of the genetics, like 80%, are Caucasus Volga. So a real good guess is that the CLV people spoke Indo-European too. And so my hypothesis for the Indo-European homeland is CLV, Caucasus / Lower Volga, and I don't know which, and it doesn't really matter very much at this point because they're obviously a common culture and common language. Furthermore, this explains the split of Hittite. What's going on is people move from the Caucasus into the Dnipro-Don area and become isolated from the place they came from, and that will be a split at almost exactly the right time. So I believe that's what happened. And the next question, which we still do not completely know, is how does the CLV get to eventually become Hittite? So what's going on is, just restating it, CLV moved to Dnipro-Don area, which form a genetic split. And then later on, the Yamnaya culture emerges. Now, something that's quite interesting is we can see that about 3500 BC, that's pretty much before Yamnaya formed culturally, but hundreds of years after Seredni, the Yamnaya went through a strong genetic bottleneck. They were reduced to 100 or 200 ancestral people in the population. So what's explaining that? Well, here's a reasonable speculation, I think. We know that these cultures are patrilocal and patrilineal clans. You typically see on one site, all the men have exactly the same genetic Y chromosome. And in fact, on the Yamnaya, on the steppe, amazingly, the Yamnaya, all the Yamnaya have essentially the same Y chromosome. So I think what's going on is you have patrilocal clans, probably a couple of hundred adults, no larger, and they're competing with each other, both probably for territory and certainly, violently as well. And one of these clans has some genius who invents the wheel wagon, right? And that becomes an enormous cultural advantage, and that cultural advantage gives you immense expansion. And the Yamnaya we see are all descended from one or two of these clans. That would explain the data very well. I say probably horse riding. That's currently controversial, and I want to do some more work on that myself. There's strong arguments they were riding horses, and also strong arguments they weren't. And I personally am not entirely sure. But certainly if they were riding horses, that would definitely add to the technical advantage. Anthony, in his book, argues that ignoring military aspects, a man on a horse can herd 4 times as many animals as a man on foot. So that's, just economically, that's why in the Wild West, cowboys were riding horses, right? That made them very efficient herders. All right. Then an extraordinary event occurs, which is, I think, one of the most amazing events in human history. This is very hard to believe, except the evidence that it happened is overwhelming. So the Yamnaya culture forms. They start to expand. They move east onto the Volga River. And then a kind of demographic explosion occurs. And about 3200 BC or thereabouts, some of these Volga guys move all the way to Siberia. There's an enormous distance, and form a culture the archaeologists call the Afanasyevo. But the Afanasyevo are genetically identical to Yamnaya Volga, right? I can see no differences whatever. In fact, in my work, I take the Afanasyevo, the Volga settlements, and I just group them all together as one population because I can't differentiate them. There's no real point in distinguishing about it. I get a bigger sample size when I lump them. So this happened incredibly quickly. My archaeological colleagues say that you can move cattle from the Volga River to Siberia in as little as 2 years. And I think that's what happened probably. Certainly no more than a generation or so, though. And some of my archaeological friends just didn't believe me when I told them this on the basis of autosomal data. But we now find a pair of relatives. I think they're second or third cousins. We're not completely sure. One of the cousins is Yamnaya in Hungary, and the other cousin is Yamnaya in Siberia. So there's just no doubt whatever that this thing happened. Yeah?
Do you have any speculation about what drove them to Siberia?
That's a very good question. Yes, I have a speculation, and I'll tell you, but it really is a speculation, probably one I'm not prepared to write down. When you look at the structure of the kurgans, the Afanasyevo kurgans look a little different than the Yamnaya kurgans. There's technical details I don't really understand or maybe even care about how they're made. And these kurgans obviously are something part of a religious ritual. I'm certain about that. So if I had to speculate, there's a pattern that's occurred many, many times in human history, which you get some sect, right? You know, you're not doing the rites correctly. We are, right? And that typically seems to cause big trouble, right? You know, in Byzantine times, people would kill each other on the basis of whether the son was the same substance of the father or the similar substance of the father, right? These religious disputes get really bitter. And my guess, just a guess, is there was a religious dispute, it got very nasty, and it got wise to move a long way. Then, who knows? We'll never know, I think. These people are illiterate, you know, how could we tell? No? But that's a good story, isn't it? Yeah. Then people move west into Western Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and they mix with the in the Eastern expansion, which I think is a little sinister actually. There's no evidence of mixing at all with any peoples who were there before, right? I mean, if there had been substantial mixing, the Aphanasia we saw in Siberia would not look like the Volga. We'd see some local genetics, but that's not what we see. In Europe, the pattern's different. There's extensive farming in Europe already. The Yamnaya move in, and a culture forms, the corded ware. That's clearly not quite, it's Yamnaya related, but not different strong differences. And the corded ware are primarily steppe, but 70 to 90%, it depends really where you're looking. And the other part of it is farmers who were there before. So that's a different pattern. There's no doubt at all, in my mind, the corded ware spoke Indo-European, and I think are the ancestors of all Indo-European, of all Indo-European European languages, and in fact, Indian languages. But the process of exactly how that happened is still not entirely clear, though we know much more than I can tell you right now. Um, oh, am I going backwards? Oh, here we are. Okay. All right. So the um, yeah, the last remaining question I haven't talked about here, but I want to say some words, is how CLV got into Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine, and we don't really know. And I'm not sure, though I have a hypothesis I think is much more likely than not. There's two, if you just look on the map, there's two likely routes. One of them is they move south of the Black Sea, through what's now Western Turkey, through what's now Eastern Turkey into Western Turkey and Anatolia. And the other is they move north of the Black Sea and come down into Anatolia through the Balkans. The linguists would prefer the second hypothesis, because when you look at the distribution of Anatolian languages in the second millennium BC, they're all in Western Ukraine. There's no evidence of Indo-European at that time in Eastern Ukraine. But there's a problem, which is the genetics don't work very well. We don't see any real sign later on of Balkan genetics in Anatolia. So that's a puzzle. And I think they came in through Eastern Ukraine. And I now have to explain why you don't see the Indo-European languages later on. Because what happens is that in the late fourth millennium and early third millennium, like 3000 BC or thereabouts, there's obviously bad demographic trouble in the Caucasus. You see two major civilizations, the Mycop and Kuraxes, collapse. You get massive immigration. And I think if CLV people are in Eastern Ukraine, these later arrivals come in and push them out. We definitely see evidence of genetics, CLV genetics in Eastern Ukraine early on, much less so later. So so the genetics work. Linguistics are a little bit of a problem, and with the other hypothesis, linguistics work, but the genetics are a problem. Well, I'm a geneticist, so that's the way I bet. But we aren't very sure. I don't know if we're ever going to resolve it, actually, unless we get much, much deeper genetic data. I don't think we're going to resolve this from better archaeology. So there's certainly lots of questions. Some of them may be answered by better data. And in general, although we have lots and lots of data, you'd always like to have more. For example, with the Hittites, very annoyingly, we don't have any provable genetics from IE speakers at the relevant period. The problem is the Hittite Empire, we believe, was multicultural and multilinguistic. So if you see genetics, and we have a little bit of just random people living in the region, you've really got very little idea who they were. There's no real reason to think they were native IE speakers. And the Hittite elite was certainly, excuse me? Okay. Excuse me, my phone is misbehaving. The Hittite elite was certainly native IE speakers, but they cremated their dead. And that does us in. I will say I got desperate at once. I went to the head of our wet lab, Nadine Rowland, who's brilliant at getting ancient DNA. And I said, is there any chance we could get ancient DNA from cremated bones? And the conversation didn't last long. She said, "Get out of here." So that's where we are. That's what I got. But I do have one final slide, which is completely irrelevant to my talk, but I always like to give that. I would like to show this when I'm giving these talks. Because this shows, I think, that we should have real respect for our ancient forebears. These are intelligent, sophisticated, and highly skilled people. What I'm showing you here is a picture of a horse carved from mammoth ivory in 30,000 BC. It's in a museum in Tübingen, which I've seen. It's quite small. It would have fitted in the palm of your hand, but it's absolutely beautiful. It's an astonishing thing. And, somebody a very long time ago made that. And this isn't science, but I think he had the same sensibility artistically that I do. So thank you very much.